morning sun cast a warm glow through the stained-glass windows of Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church in Atlanta. The congregation swayed to the rhythm of gospel music, their voices raised in joyous harmony. At the altar, Pastor Jeremiah Atkins stood tall, his charismatic presence commanding attention as he prepared to deliver his sermon. Little did anyone know that this ordinary Sunday service would soon become a scene of shocking violence, forever changing the lives of everyone present. As Pastor Jeremiah opened his Bible, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church burst open. A woman's voice, filled with rage and desperation, cut through the music like a knife. "Jeremiah, you can't ignore us anymore." Heads turned, gasps echoed through the sanctuary. There, framed in the doorway, stood Sheila Johnson, her eyes wild with fury, a gun clutched in her trembling hand. Before anyone could react, 3 shots rang out, the sound reverberating off the church walls. Pastor Jeremiah stumbled backward, crimson stains blossoming on his crisp white shirt. As he fell, his wife Isabella's anguished scream pierced the air, a sound of pure heartbreak that would haunt the congregation for years to come. In that moment, as chaos erupted and the truth began to unravel, one question hung in the air. How had it come to this? Jeremiah Atkins hadn't always been destined for the pulpit. Growing up in the tough neighborhoods of South Atlanta, he'd seen his fair share of trouble. As a teenager, he ran with a rough crowd, flirting with a life of petty crime and quick thrills. But beneath the bravado and the posturing, there was always something different about Jeremiah. A spark of charisma, a gift for words that could captivate an audience. It was his grandmother, Mama Esther, who first recognized his potential. A pillar of their local church community, she never gave up on her wayward grandson. "Boy," she'd say, fixing him with her stern gaze, "the Lord's got plans for you. You just gotta open your eyes and see it." For years, her words fell on deaf ears, but everything changed the night Jeremiah narrowly escaped a drive-by shooting that claimed the life of his best friend. As he knelt on the cold pavement, cradling his dying friend in his arms, something shifted inside him. He felt a presence, a calling he couldn't explain. The next Sunday, to the shock of his family and friends, Jeremiah walked into church of his own accord. He sat in the back pew, tears streaming down his face as the pastor spoke of redemption and second chances. From that day forward, Jeremiah Atkins was a changed man. He threw himself into Bible study with the same intensity he'd once applied to his street hustles. His natural charm and way with words, once used to talk his way out of trouble, now drew people to him as he shared his testimony. It wasn't long before he was leading youth groups, then giving guest sermons. By the time he was 25, Jeremiah had completed his theological studies and was ordained as a minister. His rise through the ranks of the church was meteoric. People were drawn to his passionate sermons, his ability to relate the Bible to modern-day struggles, and his seemingly boundless energy for community outreach. At 30, he founded Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church. Starting with just a handful of followers meeting in a rented storefront, the congregation grew rapidly. Jeremiah's magnetic personality and his message of hope and second chances resonated deeply in a community that had seen more than its share of hardship. 5 years later, Graceful Redemption had blossomed into one of Atlanta's most vibrant and fastest-growing churches. The new building, with its soaring ceilings and state-of-the-art facilities, was a testament to Pastor Jeremiah's vision and the unwavering support of his congregation. To the outside world, Pastor Jeremiah Atkins was the very model of a modern religious leader, dynamic, relatable, and deeply committed to his flock. His sermons were broadcast on local radio, and his social media presence was growing by the day. He was a regular at community events, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. But beneath the polished exterior and behind the inspiring sermons, Jeremiah carried a secret that threatened to unravel everything he had built. A secret that went by the name of Sheila Johnson. Sheila Johnson was everything Jeremiah Atkins wasn't supposed to want. Fierce, unpredictable, with a temper that could flare like a match to gasoline, she was the antithesis of the calm, controlled image he presented to the world. Yet from the moment they met, there was an undeniable attraction, a pull that defied logic and good sense. Their paths crossed at a community center where Jeremiah volunteered, counseling at-risk youth. Sheila was there to pick up her younger brother, a participant in the program. She stormed in, all fire and attitude, ready to confront whoever had kept her waiting. But when her eyes met Jeremiah's, something sparked between them. Jeremiah, still a few years away from founding his church, was immediately drawn to Sheila's raw energy and unapologetic nature. She, in turn, was intrigued by this man who exuded an aura of peace and purpose she'd never encountered before. Their relationship ignited quickly, burning hot and fast. Sheila was unlike anyone Jeremiah had ever known. She challenged him, pushed him out of his comfort zone, made him feel alive in ways he'd forgotten were possible. For a time, he convinced himself that this was what he needed, someone to keep him grounded, to remind him of the world he'd left behind. But as weeks turned to months, the cracks began to show. Sheila's temper, which had at first seemed exciting, became increasingly problematic. She was possessive, prone to jealous outbursts that left Jeremiah walking on eggshells. More than once, he found himself covering bruises, making excuses to concerned friends about the scratches on his arms. Still, he couldn't bring himself to end things. There was a vulnerability beneath Sheila's tough exterior, a need for love and acceptance that resonated with Jeremiah's own past. He told himself he could help her, that with enough patience and understanding, she would change. Then came the night that changed everything. After a particularly heated argument, Sheila stormed out of Jeremiah's apartment. Hours later, he got a call from the hospital. Sheila had been in a car accident. She was okay, but there was more. She was pregnant. The news hit Jeremiah like a thunderbolt. A baby. His baby. In that moment, all his carefully laid plans, his visions for the future, seemed to crumble around him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't marry Sheila. Her volatile nature, her unpredictability, it was no environment to raise a child in, let alone build a life together. But neither could he abandon his child. So, Jeremiah made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He would support Sheila and the baby financially, but keep them separate from his public life. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, least of all his own conscience. As Sheila's pregnancy progressed, Jeremiah's star continued to rise in the church community. He founded Graceful Redemption, pouring all his energy into building his congregation and crafting his public image. All the while, he kept Sheila and their child a closely guarded secret, meeting them in out-of-the-way places, always looking over his shoulder. Sheila, for her part, alternated between rage at being kept hidden and a desperate hope that Jeremiah would change his mind. The birth of their daughter Zoe only complicated matters further. Jeremiah was moved beyond words when he held his child for the first time, but it also cemented his resolve. He couldn't let his past mistakes derail the good work he was doing, the lives he was changing through his ministry. And so a pattern was established. Jeremiah lived two lives, the public face of Graceful Redemption and the secret father who paid visits laden with guilt and cash. Sheila, trapped in a limbo of resentment and dependence, watched from the shadows as the man she loved became a celebrated figure, always just out of her reach. It was an untenable situation, a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark would come in the form of Isabella, the woman who would become Jeremiah's wife, and unwittingly set in motion a chain of events that would end in bloodshed on the altar of Graceful Redemption. Isabella Green was everything Sheila Johnson was not. Gentle, soft-spoken, with a serene presence that seemed to calm everyone around her, She embodied the kind of partner Pastor Jeremiah believed he needed, both for himself and for his growing congregation. They met at a regional church conference where Jeremiah was a guest speaker. Isabella, a devoted member of her own church and active in various ministry programs, was immediately drawn to the charismatic young pastor. His words seemed to speak directly to her heart, igniting a passion for service she'd always felt, but never fully expressed. For Jeremiah, Isabella represented a chance at the life he'd convinced himself he deserved. A life free from the chaos and unpredictability that characterized his relationship with Sheila. Isabella's unwavering faith, her gentle spirit, and her genuine desire to serve others aligned perfectly with the image he was cultivating as the leader of Graceful Redemption. Their courtship was a whirlwind of shared prayers, long conversations about faith and purpose, and dreams of building a powerful ministry together. Isabella saw in Jeremiah a man of God, someone who had overcome a troubled past to become a beacon of hope for others. She felt blessed to be chosen by such a man, never suspecting the secrets that lay beneath his polished exterior. For Jeremiah, guilt gnawed at him even as he fell deeper in love with Isabella. He knew he should tell her about Sheila and Zoe, but fear held him back. Fear of losing everything he'd worked for. Fear of disappointing the woman who looked at him with such adoration and respect. And so, he convinced himself that his past was just that, past. That moving forward with Isabella was God's plan for his life. Their wedding was the event of the season in Atlanta's church community. Graceful Redemption was packed to the rafters as Pastor Jeremiah and Isabella exchanged vows before God and their congregation. The couple seemed to glow with happiness and purpose, a shining example of Christian love and partnership. As Isabella settled into her role as the pastor's wife, she threw herself into the work of the church with boundless enthusiasm. She started new outreach programs, counseled young couples, and became a beloved figure in her own right among the congregation. Her genuine warmth and compassion complemented Jeremiah's dynamic preaching style perfectly. Together, they were a power couple in the truest sense. Graceful Redemption flourished under their leadership, expanding its reach and influence throughout Atlanta and beyond. They were featured in Christian magazines, invited to speak at conferences, and held up as role models for young people in the community. But even as Jeremiah basked in the glow of his picture-perfect life, the shadow of his past loomed ever larger. Sheila, watching from afar as the man she considered hers built a life with another woman, grew increasingly bitter and unstable. The payments Jeremiah sent for Zoe's care were no longer enough to placate her. She wanted more money, more time, more acknowledgement. Isabella, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just out of sight, continued to support her husband in all his endeavors. She noticed occasional moments of distraction or worry in Jeremiah's demeanor, but attributed them to the stress of leading such a large and growing congregation. Her faith in him never wavered. As months turned to years, Jeremiah found himself trapped in an increasingly precarious balancing act. On one side, his thriving ministry and devoted wife. On the other, a volatile ex-lover and the daughter he saw only in secret. He told himself he was doing the right thing, protecting everyone involved by keeping these two worlds separate. But with each passing day, with each lie of omission to Isabella, with each tense, furtive meeting with Sheila, the weight of his deception grew heavier. Jeremiah began to withdraw, spending long hours alone in his study, ostensibly working on sermons, but in reality grappling with the moral quagmire of his own making. Isabella, sensing her husband's growing distance, redoubled her efforts to support him. She organized prayer circles, took on more responsibilities at the church, anything to ease the burden she imagined he carried as a spiritual leader. Her unwavering devotion only deepened Jeremiah's sense of guilt and unworthiness. As pressure mounted from both sides, Sheila's increasing demands and Isabella's concerned attentiveness, Jeremiah felt the carefully constructed walls of his double life beginning to crumble. He knew, in his heart of hearts, that a reckoning was coming. What he couldn't have imagined was the violent form that reckoning would take, or the devastating consequences it would have for everyone he loved. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake graceful redemption to its very foundations and force long-buried truths into the unforgiving light of day. The cracks in Pastor Jeremiah's carefully constructed facade began to show on a warm Sunday in late spring. The church was buzzing with excitement over the upcoming anniversary celebration, marking 5 years since Graceful Redemption's founding. Isabella had thrown herself into the planning, coordinating volunteers, arranging for guest speakers, and organizing a community outreach event to coincide with the festivities. Jeremiah, however, seemed distracted and on edge. His sermons, usually delivered with passionate conviction, felt flat and uninspired. Isabella noticed dark circles under his eyes, a tightness in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. "Is everything all right, my love?" she asked one evening, her voice soft with concern. "You seem distant lately." Jeremiah forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just feeling the weight of responsibility, dear. This anniversary, it's a big milestone for us. I want everything to be perfect." Isabella wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever burdens you're carrying, let me help bear them." Her words, meant to comfort, only intensified the guilt churning in Jeremiah's gut. If only she knew the true nature of the burden he carried. Unbeknownst to Isabella, Jeremiah's world was unraveling rapidly behind the scenes. Sheila had become increasingly erratic in her demands, no longer satisfied with the monthly payments or the occasional visits. She wanted more. More money, more time with Jeremiah, more acknowledgement of her place in his life. Their most recent meeting had ended in a screaming match, with Sheila threatening to expose everything to the church if Jeremiah didn't leave Isabella and publicly claim her and Zoe as his family. "You can't keep us hidden forever, Jeremiah," Sheila yelled, her eyes wild with a mixture of pain and rage. "I'm tired of being your dirty little secret. Either you man up and do right by us, or I swear to God I'll burn your whole perfect life to the ground." Jeremiah had left that encounter shaken to his core. He knew Sheila well enough to know she wasn't bluffing. The careful balance he'd maintained for years was teetering on the brink of collapse. As the anniversary celebration drew nearer, Jeremiah's behavior became increasingly erratic. He canceled meetings last minute, disappeared for hours without explanation, and snapped at church staff over minor issues. The congregation began to whisper, concern and confusion spreading like ripples in a pond. Isabella, ever the loyal wife, ran interference as best she could. She smoothed ruffled feathers, made excuses for her husband's absences, and prayed fervently for whatever was troubling him to pass. But even her seemingly boundless patience was beginning to wear thin. The situation came to a head 2 days before the anniversary celebration. Jeremiah had promised to meet with the event planning committee to finalize details, but he was nowhere to be found. Calls to his cell phone went straight to voicemail. Isabella, fighting down a rising sense of panic, decided to check his study. As she approached the door, she heard Jeremiah's voice, low and urgent. He was on the phone, his tone one she'd never heard before, desperate, pleading. "Sheila, please. You have to understand. I can't just walk away from everything. There has to be another way." Isabella froze, her hand on the doorknob. Sheila? Who was Sheila? And what was Jeremiah talking about walking away from? "No, listen to me," Jeremiah continued, unaware of his wife's presence just outside the door. "I'll figure something out, okay? I'll increase the payments. Just please, give me more time. Don't do anything rash." The blood drained from Isabella's face as the implications of what she was hearing began to sink in. Payments? More time? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but circling back to one inescapable conclusion. Her husband, the man she'd built her life around, was hiding something monumental from her. With trembling hands, she pushed open the door. Jeremiah spun around, the phone still clutched to his ear, his face a mask of shock and guilt. "Isabella," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can explain." But in that moment, looking into her husband's eyes, Isabella realized that no explanation could undo the betrayal she felt. Whatever Jeremiah was about to say, whatever justifications he might offer, nothing would ever be the same again. As the truth began to spill out, haltingly at first, then in a torrent of confession and apology, Isabella felt her world crumbling around her. The perfect life she thought she had, the blessed union she believed God had orchestrated, it was all built on a foundation of lies. Across town, Sheila Johnson paced her small apartment, rage and hurt warring within her. Jeremiah's pleas for more time, his continued refusal to acknowledge her and Zoe publicly, had pushed her to the breaking point. As she looked at her daughter, peacefully coloring at the kitchen table, unaware of the turmoil surrounding her very existence, something inside Sheila snapped. "No more waiting," she muttered, her eyes falling on the drawer where she kept the gun Jeremiah had insisted she had for protection. No more hiding in the shadows. In that moment, as Isabella's world fell apart in the study of graceful redemption, and Sheila made a fateful decision in her rundown apartment, the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. The carefully constructed facade of Pastor Jeremiah Atkins was about to come crashing down in the most public and violent way possible. The morning of Graceful Redemption's 5th anniversary dawned bright and clear, a beautiful day that seemed to promise joy and celebration. But within the walls of the church, and in two very different households across Atlanta, storm clouds were gathering. Isabella had barely slept, her mind reeling from the revelations of the previous day. The existence of Sheila and Zoe, the years of deception, the double life her husband had been leading, it was almost too much to process. She'd spent the night alternating between bouts of angry tears and fervent prayers for guidance. Jeremiah, for his part, looked like a man who'd aged a decade overnight. The weight of his sins, long carried in secret, now bore down on him with crushing force. He'd spent hours trying to explain, to justify his actions, but Isabella's silence, her look of utter devastation, cut deeper than any words could have. As the first light of dawn crept through their bedroom window, Isabella stirred from her fitful sleep. She looked at Jeremiah, this man she thought she knew so well, and felt a complex mix of emotions: love, hurt, anger, confusion. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Jeremiah sat up, running a hand over his face. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we have to get through today. The church, they're all expecting us. We can't let them down." Isabella laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Let them down? Like you've let me down? Like you've let God down?" Jeremiah flinched at her words, but he couldn't argue. He deserved every ounce of her anger and more. "You're right," he said softly. "I've failed. Failed you, failed our congregation, failed in my duty as a man of God. But please, Isabella, let me try to make this right. After the service today, I'll confess everything to the church elders. I'll step down if that's what it takes. Just help me get through this day." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, weighing her husband's words. Finally she nodded, her face a mask of resolve. "For the sake of the congregation, for the people who believe in us and the work we do, I'll stand beside you today. But after that, I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Jeremiah." Across town, in a small, cluttered apartment, Sheila Johnson was also preparing for the day ahead. But her preparations were of a very different nature. She moved with a manic energy, her eyes bright with a dangerous mix of determination and desperation. Zoe, sensing the tension in the air, watched her mother warily. "Mama, where are we going?" Sheila paused in her frantic packing, forcing a smile for her daughter. "We're gonna see your daddy, baby. It's time he introduced us to everyone." As she spoke, her hand brushed against the cold metal of the gun, tucked into her purse. A shiver ran down her spine, but she pushed away any doubts. This was it. No more hiding, no more empty promises. One way or another, Jeremiah was going to face the truth today. Back at Graceful Redemption, the church was filling up quickly. The anniversary celebration had drawn a larger crowd than usual, with visitors from other congregations and community leaders in attendance. The atmosphere was festive, with excited chatter filling the air as people found their seats. Backstage, in the small room where he usually prepared for services, Jeremiah knelt in prayer. His words, usually flowing so easily, now came in broken, desperate whispers. "Lord, I have sinned. I have strayed so far from your path. Please, give me strength. Show me the way forward." A soft knock at the door interrupted his supplication. It was Isabella, her face composed, but her eyes still showing the pain of betrayal. "It's time," she said simply. Jeremiah nodded, rising to his feet. As he moved to follow her, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, burdened, a far cry from the confident, charismatic leader his congregation knew. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out onto the stage. The familiar swell of music, the expectant faces of his flock, it all felt surreal. Isabella took her usual seat in the front row, her smile firmly in place despite the turmoil in her heart. As Jeremiah began to speak, welcoming everyone to this special service, he was acutely aware of the lies that underpinned every word. He spoke of God's faithfulness, of the blessings bestowed upon Graceful Redemption over the past 5 years, all while knowing that his own faithlessness threatened to bring it all crashing down. Halfway through his sermon, as he was building to what should have been an inspiring crescendo, the doors at the back of the church burst open with a bang that echoed through the sanctuary. Every head turned, a collective gasp rising from the congregation. There, framed in the doorway, stood Sheila Johnson, her eyes wild, her chest heaving with emotion. In one hand she clutched the hand of a confused-looking little girl. In the other, Jeremiah's blood ran cold as he registered the glint of metal. A gun. Sheila had a gun. "Jeremiah," she screamed, her voice raw with pain and rage. "No more lies, no more hiding. It's time everyone knew the truth." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jeremiah stood frozen at the pulpit, his mouth open but no words coming out. Isabella, her face a mask of shock, looked from Sheila to her husband, the full reality of the situation crashing down on her. And then, in a blur of motion and sound, chaos erupted. Sheila began to move down the aisle, the gun now raised and pointed directly at Jeremiah. People scrambled to get out of her way, screams and shouts filling the air. Some ran for the exits, while others seemed paralyzed with fear. "Sheila, please," Jeremiah finally found his voice, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Think about what you're doing. Think about Zoe." At the mention of her daughter's name, Sheila's face contorted with fury. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare use her name. You've denied her for years, kept us hidden like we're something to be ashamed of." She was at the front of the church now, mere feet away from where Jeremiah stood. Isabella, moving on instinct, started to rise from her seat, but Sheila swung the gun toward her. "Stay right there," she snarled. "This is between me and your precious pastor." Isabella froze, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself but for her husband. Despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, she couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Jeremiah, seeing the gun pointed at his wife, felt a surge of protective anger. "Sheila, this is madness. Put the gun down. We can talk about this." Sheila laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Talk? That's all you ever do, Jeremiah. Talk and make promises you never keep. Well, I'm done talking. I'm done waiting. It's time for action. She turned back to the congregation, many of whom were watching the scene unfold in horrified silence. You all think you know this man, she shouted. Your beloved Pastor Jeremiah. But you don't know him at all. This girl, she pulled Zoe closer, this is his daughter. My daughter. The child he's been hiding from all of you for years. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Eyes darted between Sheila, the terrified child at her side, and their pastor, searching for confirmation or denial. Jeremiah, realizing that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, made a decision. No more lies. No more hiding. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the truth. She's right, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. I have a daughter. I've been living a lie, deceiving all of you, deceiving my wife. He looked at Isabella, tears welling in his eyes. I'm so sorry for everything. For a moment, it seemed as though his confession might diffuse the situation. Sheila's hand, still gripping the gun, lowered slightly. But then her face hardened once more. Sorry isn't enough, she spat. Sorry, don't feed our child. Sorry doesn't make up for years of being treated like your dirty little secret. She raised the gun again, her finger tightening on the trigger. You had your chance, Jeremiah. Now it's too late. Time seemed to slow down. Jeremiah saw Sheila's finger squeeze the trigger. He heard Isabella's scream, saw her lunge forward as if to shield him. And then, pain exploded in his chest as the first shot rang out. He staggered backward, his hand clutching at the growing red stain on his shirt. 2 more shots followed in quick succession, and Jeremiah felt his legs give way. He collapsed to the floor of the altar, dimly aware of the chaos erupting around him. Isabella was at his side in an instant, her hands pressing desperately against his wounds, her tears falling on his face. Jeremiah, stay with me, she pleaded. Please, God, don't take him. Through the haze of pain and encroaching darkness, Jeremiah saw Sheila standing over him, the gun now hanging limply at her side. Her face was a mask of shock, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd done. I just wanted you to love us, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the screams and commotion filling the church. As consciousness began to slip away, Jeremiah's last coherent thought was a prayer. Not for himself, but for the people he'd hurt. For Isabella, for Sheila, for Zoe, for his congregation. He prayed for forgiveness, for healing, for a way forward through the mess he'd created. And then, as sirens wailed in the distance and the world faded to black, Pastor Jeremiah Atkins surrendered himself to the judgment of a higher power. The shots that rang out in Graceful Redemption Church that Sunday morning echoed far beyond its walls, sending shockwaves through the community and leaving a wake of devastation in their path. Pastor Jeremiah Atkins, once the charismatic leader of a thriving congregation, now lay in a hospital bed, hovering between life and death. The doctors had managed to stabilize him, but his condition remained critical. 3 bullet wounds, 2 to the chest, 1 to the abdomen, had done severe damage. It would be days before anyone knew if he would survive, let alone recover. Isabella, her clothes still stained with her husband's blood, kept a constant vigil at his bedside. Her world had been shattered twice in as many days, first by the revelation of Jeremiah's infidelity and secret child, and then by the violent attack that had nearly taken him from her. She oscillated between grief, anger, and a desperate, clinging hope that somehow they would find a way through this nightmare. Sheila Johnson was in police custody, charged with attempted murder and a host of other offenses. The image of her standing in the church doorway, gun in hand, had been splashed across every news outlet in Atlanta. To some, she was a villain, a scorned woman who had resorted to violence in a fit of jealous rage. To others, her story struck a chord. A single mother, betrayed and abandoned, pushed to the brink by years of secrecy and broken promises. Zoe, the innocent child at the center of it all, had been taken into protective custody. Social services were working to locate her nearest relatives, but the process was complicated by the sudden public revelation of her paternity. She was confused, frightened, and desperately missed her mother, unable to understand the gravity of what had transpired. The congregation of Graceful Redemption was left reeling, their faith shaken to its core. The church that had been a beacon of hope and redemption now stood as a crime scene, yellow police tape, a stark contrast to the celebratory banners that still hung limply from its walls. In the days that followed, a flurry of revelations came to light. Financial records showed years of payments from Jeremiah to Sheila, siphoned from church funds through a complex web of accounts. Church elders, investigating further, uncovered a pattern of deception that went beyond just the secret family. There were questionable real estate deals, inflated expense reports, a lifestyle that didn't quite match the modest pastor's salary Jeremiah claimed to live on. The media descended like vultures, eager to pick apart every detail of the scandal. Reporters camped outside the hospital, the church, even Isabella's home, hungry for any new development or statement. The story had all the elements of a sensational headline: sex, lies, violence, all set against the backdrop of a supposedly righteous religious community. For Isabella, the constant scrutiny was almost unbearable. She had gone from being the admired wife of a respected pastor to an object of pity and speculation overnight. People whispered behind her back, wondering how she could have been so blind, debating whether she had known about Jeremiah's deceptions all along. Despite the betrayal, despite the public humiliation, Isabella found herself unable to completely turn her back on the man she had loved for so long. She prayed fervently for his recovery, even as she grappled with the question of whether their marriage could survive this ordeal. 1 week after the shooting, as Jeremiah still lay unconscious, Isabella finally agreed to a meeting with Sheila's court-appointed lawyer. It was a difficult decision, one that went against the advice of friends and family, who thought she should focus solely on her own healing. But Isabella felt compelled to understand, to hear the other side of the story that had so dramatically upended her life. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the courthouse, under the watchful eye of a court officer. Sheila, handcuffed and wearing a prison jumpsuit, looked a far cry from the wild-eyed woman who had stormed into the church. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow with a mix of regret and resignation. For a long moment, the two women simply stared at each other, the weight of their shared connection to Jeremiah hanging heavy in the air between them. "I'm sorry." Sheila finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to go this far. I couldn't take it anymore. The lies, the broken promises, watching him build this perfect life while Zoe and I struggled." Isabella listened, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. Part of her wanted to lash out, to unleash all the pain and anger she'd been holding inside. But another part recognized the broken woman before her as yet another victim of Jeremiah's deceptions. "I'm not here to judge you, Sheila," Isabella said softly. "I can't condone what you did, but I think I'm starting to understand why you did it. We've both have been deceived by the same man." Sheila's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. She hadn't expected understanding, let alone empathy, from the woman whose life she had so violently disrupted. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Sheila said, her voice cracking. "I just wanted Jeremiah to acknowledge us, to give Zoe the father she deserves. But every time I threatened to tell the truth, he'd make more promises, send more money, and nothing would change." Isabella nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "How long?" she asked. "How long has this been going on?" Sheila sighed, her shoulders sagging. "We met before he founded the church. Before you. Zoe was born just after Graceful Redemption opened its doors. For a while I thought he'd leave it all behind for us. But then he met you, and suddenly we were a problem to be managed. not a family to be embraced. The weight of this revelation hit Isabella hard. Her entire relationship with Jeremiah, the foundation of their life together, had been built on a lie. She felt a fresh wave of anger, not just at her husband, but at the circumstances that had brought them all to this point. "What happens now?" Isabella asked, more to herself than to Sheila. Sheila shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know. I've ruined everything. Zoe, oh God, what have I done to my baby girl?" For the first time since the shooting, Isabella felt a spark of purpose ignite within her. Whatever sins Jeremiah and Sheila had committed, whatever pain they had caused, there was an innocent child caught in the middle of it all. "Zoe shouldn't suffer for the mistakes of her parents," Isabella said firmly. "Whatever happens with the legal proceedings, whatever happens with Jeremiah, I'll make sure she's taken care of." Sheila looked at her in disbelief. "Why would you do that? After everything?" Isabella met her gaze steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because, in a way, we're connected now. Not just through Jeremiah, but through this shared experience of betrayal and pain. We can let it destroy us, or we can find a way to move forward." As the meeting drew to a close, both women felt the weight of unspoken questions and uncertain futures. But there was also a glimmer of something else, a tentative understanding, a shared resolve to find healing, not just for themselves, but for the innocent child caught in the crossfire of adult mistakes. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for a statement, cameras flashing as Isabella emerged. But for the first time since the scandal broke, she faced them with a sense of calm determination. "I have no comment at this time," she said firmly. "But I ask that you respect the privacy of all involved, especially the children affected by this situation. Thank you." As she walked away, head held high, Isabella felt a subtle shift within herself. The path ahead was far from clear, but she was no longer simply a victim of circumstances. She was a woman determined to forge her own way forward, to find redemption not in the hollow promises of a flawed man, but in her own capacity for compassion and resilience. Back at the hospital, Jeremiah Atkins lay still, machines beeping a steady rhythm around him. His physical wounds were slowly healing, but the true extent of the damage he had caused, to his family, his congregation, and his own soul, was yet to be fully revealed. As he hovered between life and death, the world he had so carefully constructed continued to unravel, leaving those he had hurt to pick up the pieces and find their own paths to healing and redemption. As days turned into weeks, the scandal surrounding Graceful Redemption Church continued to unfold, revealing layers of deception that went far beyond Jeremiah's secret family. The church elders, working in conjunction with forensic accountants, uncovered a web of financial irregularities that painted a damning picture of their once-beloved pastor. It seemed that Jeremiah's charisma and gift for persuasion had extended far beyond the pulpit. He had cultivated a network of wealthy donors, promising them spiritual guidance and divine favor in exchange for special offerings that often found their way into his personal accounts. The money trail led to offshore bank accounts, luxury purchases carefully hidden from public view, and a series of real estate investments that had nothing to do with church business. For the congregation, each new revelation was another blow to their faith and trust. Many struggled to reconcile the man they had admired and followed with the fraudster now being exposed in the media. Some clung desperately to their belief in Jeremiah's essential goodness, convinced that there must be some explanation, some justification for his actions. Others felt betrayed and angry, their faith not just in their pastor but in the entire institution of the church shaken to its core. Isabella, still reeling from the personal betrayal, found herself thrust into a leadership role she had never anticipated. With Jeremiah still unconscious and the church in chaos, she became the de facto spokesperson, working tirelessly to hold the community together and to ensure that the charitable works of Graceful Redemption continued despite the scandal. It was exhausting, often thankless work. She faced skepticism from those who wondered how she could have been unaware of her husband's deceptions, and resentment from those who blamed her for not keeping him on a righteous path. But Isabella drew strength from an unexpected source: her growing relationship with Zoe. True to her word, Isabella had taken steps to ensure that Jeremiah and Sheila's daughter was cared for. Working with social services, she had arranged for Zoe to stay with Jeremiah's sister, Angela, a kind-hearted woman who had been as shocked as anyone by the revelations about her brother. Isabella visited Zoe regularly, slowly building a bond with the confused and frightened little girl. She found solace in Zoe's innocence, in the child's ability to find joy even in the midst of upheaval. And in caring for Zoe, in trying to protect her from the harsh realities of the adult world, Isabella discovered reserves of strength and compassion she hadn't known she possessed. It was during one of these visits, about a month after the shooting, that Isabella received the call she had been both dreading and hoping for. Jeremiah was awake. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beep of monitors when Isabella entered. Jeremiah lay propped up slightly, his face gaunt and pale, a shadow of the vibrant man he had once been. When he saw her, a complex mix of emotions flickered across his face: relief, shame, fear. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse, "I didn't think you'd come." She stood at the foot of his bed, arms crossed, her face a carefully composed mask. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "But we have a lot to talk about, Jeremiah. A lot that needs to be said." He nodded weakly, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," he began, but Isabella held up a hand, cutting him off. "Sorry doesn't begin to cover it," she said firmly. "Do you have any idea of the damage you've caused? Not just to me, not just to Sheila and Zoe, but to everyone who believed in you, who trusted you?" Jeremiah closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said softly. "It started so small, just a little misdirection here, a small omission there, and then it grew, and before I knew it, I was trapped in this web of lies, unable to find a way out without destroying everything." Isabella listened, her heart a battleground of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to comfort him, to fall back into the familiar role of supportive wife. But a stronger part, the part that had been forged in the crucible of the past month, held firm. "You had choices, Jeremiah," she said. "Every step of the way, you had choices. You chose to lie. You chose to deceive. You chose to build this house of cards, knowing that someday it would all come crashing down." He nodded, not attempting to defend himself. "You're right," he admitted. "I got lost in the power, in the adulation. I convinced myself that I was doing God's work, that the ends justifies the means. But in the process, I strayed so far from his path." For a long moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken words and shattered dreams. Finally, Isabella spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said. "I don't know if our marriage can survive this. But right now, that's not what matters. What matters is making things right, as much as they can be made right." Jeremiah looked at her, a glimmer of his old intensity in his eyes. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Isabella took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew would be a difficult road ahead. "First, you need to come clean, about everything. No more lies, no more half-truths. You owe that to me, to the congregation, to everyone you've deceived." He nodded, a look of both fear and relief crossing his face. "And then, Isabella continued, you need to face the consequences of your actions, legal, financial, moral, all of it. It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but it's the only way forward." Jeremiah closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of her words. When he opened them again, there was a resolve there that Isabella hadn't seen in a long time. "You're right," he said softly. It's time to face the truth, no matter how painful. As Isabella left the hospital that day, she felt a strange mix of emotions. There was still anger, still hurt, still a deep sense of betrayal, but there was also a glimmer of something else. Not forgiveness? Not yet, but perhaps the first tentative step on the long road to healing. In the weeks and months that followed, the full story of Jeremiah Atkins and Graceful Redemption Church unfolded in a series of painful revelations. There were tearful confessions, legal proceedings, and a media frenzy that seemed to feed on every new detail. Jeremiah, true to his word, held nothing back. He admitted to financial fraud, to years of infidelity, to a pattern of manipulation that had touched nearly every aspect of his ministry. He pleaded guilty to multiple charges, accepting a prison sentence that many felt was too lenient, but which represented a stark fall from grace for the once celebrated pastor. The church itself underwent a painful period of soul-searching and restructuring. Many members left, unable to reconcile their faith with the betrayal they had experienced. But a core group remained, determined to rebuild on a foundation of transparency and genuine service. Isabella, somewhat to her own surprise, found herself at the center of this renewal. Her strength, compassion, and unwavering commitment to the truth earned her the respect and trust of those who stayed. Slowly, painfully, Graceful Redemption began to live up to its name, becoming a place of healing not just for its members, but for a community that had been rocked by scandal. And through it all, at the heart of this storm of redemption and reckoning, was Zoe. The little girl who had unknowingly set these events in motion became a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Isabella, with the support of Angela and even, tentatively, Sheila, who was serving her own sentence, albeit a shorter one, worked to create a stable, loving environment for Zoe. It wasn't easy. There were difficult conversations, tears, and moments of doubt. But as the years passed, as wounds slowly began to heal, a new kind of family emerged from the ashes of betrayal and violence. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't what anyone had envisioned, but it was real, and it was built on a foundation of hard-won truth and genuine love. Jeremiah, serving his time and undergoing intensive therapy, watched from afar as his daughter grew, as his former congregation found new purpose, as the woman he had wronged so deeply became a pillar of strength for so many. It was a bittersweet reckoning, a daily reminder of what he had lost through his own actions, but also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of genuine faith. And Isabella, who had once defined herself primarily as a pastor's wife, discovered a strength and purpose she had never known she possessed. She became a voice for accountability within religious institutions, an advocate for those who had been betrayed by leaders they trusted, and a living example of how one could find faith not in the infallibility of human leaders, but in the enduring power of compassion, truth, and the capacity for genuine redemption. The story of Graceful Redemption Church, of Jeremiah and Isabella, of Sheila and Zoe, would be told and retold for years to come. It was a cautionary tale, yes, but also a testament to the complex, often messy nature of human relationships, the high cost of deception, and the transformative power of facing the truth, no matter how painful. In the end, it was a story of fall and redemption, of broken trust and rebuilt faith, of the long, difficult journey from betrayal to forgiveness. And at its heart was a simple truth that Jeremiah had lost sight of, but which Isabella and others had rediscovered through their trials, that true grace, true redemption, comes not from grand gestures or charismatic leadership, but from the daily choice to face our flaws, to speak the truth, and to meet even the deepest betrayals with a commitment to healing and growth. As the sun set on another day in Atlanta, casting long shadows across the rebuilt and renamed Hope Restoration Community Center, formerly Graceful Redemption Church, Isabella stood for a moment, watching as the last of the day's visitors departed. Zoe, now a teenager, came to stand beside her, slipping her hand into Isabella's with the easy affection of years. "Do you think he ever really understood?" Zoe asked softly, her eyes on the fading light. "My father, I mean. Do you think he ever really got why what he did was so wrong?" Isabella squeezed the girl's hand, considering her answer carefully. "I think," she said finally, "that understanding comes in stages. Your father, he lost his way long before that day in the church. But I believe that in facing the consequences of his actions, in losing everything he thought was important, he's had the chance to find a truer understanding of faith, of love, of what really matters." Zoe nodded, leaning her head on Isabella's shoulder. "I'm glad you're here," she said simply. "I'm glad we found a way through all of this." Isabella felt a familiar warmth in her chest, a mixture of love for this child who had come into her life in such an unexpected way, and gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. It hadn't been easy, and there were still difficult days ahead. But standing there in the fading light of another day of service and healing, Isabella felt a deep sense of peace. "So am I, sweetheart," she said softly. "So am I." As they turned to go inside, to close up for the night and head home, Isabella caught sight of a familiar face in the parking lot. Sheila, waiting to pick up Zoe for their weekly dinner. There was a nod of acknowledgement between the two women, a silent recognition of the long, painful road they had traveled together. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still scars, still moments of doubt and pain, but it was a real ending. One forged in the fires of truth and tempered by the enduring power of love and forgiveness. And in that reality, in the messy, complicated, beautiful truth of their shared journey, there was a redemption far more powerful than any Jeremiah had ever preached from his pulpit. As the lights of Hope Restoration dimmed and the small family made their way home, the stars began to emerge in the Atlanta sky. A reminder that even in the darkest nights, there is always light to be found, if we have the courage to look for it, and the strength to keep moving forward, one step at a time. A warm breeze rustled through the leaves of the old oak tree that stood sentinel over the small cemetery on the outskirts of Atlanta. Beneath its spreading branches, a small group had gathered, their faces solemn, but not without a measure of peace. At the center of the group stood Isabella, her hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with the wisdom of years and experiences that had both broken and remade her. Beside her, Zoe, now a poised young woman in her mid-20s, stood with an arm around her mother, Sheila. Time and shared struggles had softened the edges of their once fractured relationship, forging an unconventional but fiercely loyal family unit. They were there to say a final goodbye to Jeremiah Atkins. Released from prison 5 years earlier, he had spent his remaining days working in a small ministry for ex-offenders, trying in his own way to make amends for the damage he had caused. His death had come suddenly, a heart attack in the night, leaving behind a complex legacy of pain, redemption, and unfinished business. As the minister spoke words of comfort and reflection, Isabella's mind wandered back over the tumultuous decade that had passed since that fateful day in Graceful Redemption Church. The years had been filled with challenges, with moments of doubt and despair, but also with unexpected joys and hard-won victories. Hope Restoration Community Center had flourished, becoming a beacon of genuine service and healing in the community. Isabella had found her true calling, not as a pastor's wife, but as a leader in her own right, guiding the center with a combination of compassion and clear-eyed pragmatism that earned her the respect of all who knew her. Sheila, after serving her sentence, had thrown herself into advocacy work, using her own story to shed light on the complex issues of domestic violence and the often overlooked struggles of single mothers. Her journey from villain to voice of change had been arduous, marked by setbacks and moments of deep remorse, but she had persevered, finding purpose in helping others avoid the desperate choices she had made. And Zoe, the innocent child at the center of the storm, had grown into a remarkable young woman. Shaped by the unconventional circumstances of her upbringing, she had developed a deep empathy for those society often overlooked, channeling her experiences into a budding career in social work. As the service concluded and the small group began to disperse, Isabella found herself standing alone before Jeremiah's grave. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Zoe, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Are you okay?" Zoe asked softly, slipping her hand into Isabella's. Isabella squeezed her hand, a sad smile touching her lips. I don't know what I am," she admitted. "There's so much I never got to say to him, so much left unresolved." Zoe nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Do you regret not trying to reconcile? After he got out of prison, I mean." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I don't think regret is the right word," she said finally. "I made my choices just as he made his. I couldn't find it in myself to let him back into my life, not fully. But I'm grateful that he found a way to do some good in the end, that he tried to make amends." "He wasn't a good man," Zoe said, her voice tinged with the complexity of emotions that came with being Jeremiah's daughter. "But he wasn't all bad either, was he?" Isabella shook her head. "No, he wasn't. He was human, flawed, selfish, capable of great harm, but also capable of love, of growth. In the end, I think he understood the damage he'd done. Whether that's enough? Well, that's not for us to judge." They stood in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. Finally, Isabella turned, ready to leave. But Zoe hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small worn Bible. "I found this in his things," she explained. "It was the one he used in prison. I thought, maybe you'd want to have it." Isabella took the book, running her fingers over the cracked leather cover. She opened it carefully, and a slip of paper fell out, a handwritten note in Jeremiah's familiar scrawl. With trembling hands, she unfolded it and read, "Isabella, I know these words can never undo the hurt I've caused, but I need you to know that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I lost my way, lost sight of what truly mattered, and in doing so, I lost the most precious gift God ever gave me, your love and trust. I don't ask for forgiveness, I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that the work you're doing, the lives you're changing, it's everything I once dreamed of for our ministry. You've taken our broken dreams and built something beautiful from the pieces. I am more proud of you than I can ever express, and more grateful than you will ever know for the way you've cared for Zoe. You are the truest example of God's love and grace that I have ever known. Always, Jeremiah." Tears slipped down Isabella's cheeks as she folded the note and tucked it back into the Bible. She hugged the book to her chest, feeling a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying begin to lift. "Are you okay?" Zoe asked again, concerned in her voice. Isabella nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "Yes, I think I am." As they walked away from the grave, arm in arm, Isabella felt a sense of closure washing over her. The past decade had been a journey she never could have anticipated, from betrayed wife to community leader, from victim to victor. She had lost much, but gained so much more. A deeper understanding of herself, a more nuanced faith, and a family forged in the fires of adversity. The sun was setting as they reached the car, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Sheila was waiting for them, a tentative smile on her face. The three women looked at each other, their shared history a complex tapestry of pain and healing, of mistakes and forgiveness. "Ready to go home?" Sheila asked softly. Isabella nodded, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." As they drove away, leaving behind the physical reminder of Jeremiah and all he had represented, Isabella felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road had been long and often painful, but it had led her here. to a place of strength, of purpose, of genuine love and community. The story of Graceful Redemption Church, of the pastor who fell from grace and the lives left in the wake of his actions, would always be a part of her. But it no longer defined her. What defined her now was the work she did each day, the lives she touched, the love she shared with her unconventional but deeply bonded family. As Atlanta's skyline came into view, Isabella thought about the next day's work at Hope Restoration, about the new programs they were developing, about the countless stories of healing and redemption she witnessed every day. And she knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this messy, beautiful, real life was the truest expression of grace she had ever known. The past could not be changed, but the future stretched out before them, full of possibility. And Isabella, along with Zoe and Sheila, was ready to meet it, stronger, wiser, and more full of genuine hope than she had ever been before. As they pulled up to the house they now shared, a home filled with laughter and love, despite the painful journey that had brought them together, Isabella felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was not the life she had once envisioned, but it was a life rich with meaning, with purpose, with love. And in the end, she realized that was the greatest redemption of all.